rather nervous and intimidated by you all, so bear with me. I'm delighted, though, to be invited to speak here, and in a way I feel something of a charlatan by saying that this is a powerful idea, number 2, and then to go on and talk about happiness, because I'm about to say that happiness is a nonsense idea. But let me try and untangle it. As we speak, the country's leading political policy and statistical minds are grappling with the coalition government's endeavour to measure and assess the nation's happiness. In November last year, the Office for National Statistics launched a consultation exercise, which will end at mid-April, asking us all to debate what things would improve or detract from our national well-being, asking us to assess the best methods to measure public satisfaction and how happy we all are. And no doubt organisations, many of you represented here this evening, are eagerly joining in this consultation, or certainly you should be. The government has gone out of its way to encourage people to participate, and I know I write for the MJ, the Municipal Journal, as was, and I know that there's constant attempts at telling councils, certainly, and the third sector, that organisations need to become well-being aware. Now, many commentators have noted that measuring happiness is a slightly mad premise. To quote one, it's like attempting to nail jelly to the floor. And indeed, making fun of happiness surveys could provide people like me with endless sport. After all, there's been centuries of philosophical debate on happiness. It's exercised great minds from Socrates to Montaigne to Bentham, Mill, and the authors of the American Constitution. And I think that that might indicate that happiness is neither simple nor uncontroversial, and certainly not easy to measure. But I do want to try and dig a little bit deeper than that and critique what I think is really dangerous in the contemporary focus on happiness. But first of all, to give a bit of context. First of all, the happiness issue is not a sinister coalition plot, and I'm not here to bash the government much. I have an interest, the interest rather in making happiness integral to social policy decision-making is across all parties, and has been a preoccupation for a good 10 years or so in terms of British politics, and is increasingly so internationally. In the UK, it was initiated by New Labour, which, if you remember, appointed the LSE economics professor, Lord Richard Layard, as a happiness czar. And that was instigated, in fact, enthusiastically by Ed Miliband when he was at the Cabinet Office. He went on to suggest that politicians should move away from narrowly focusing on improving economic prosperity and instead attend to citizens' quote, emotional well-being, and noted that there was increased numbers in Western societies who were becoming more depressed. And he linked the happiness agenda very much to improving mental health of the nation. Lord Layard's approach caught on. David Cameron, one of the first things he actually publicly proclaimed when he became a new leader of the Conservative Party was that he was keen to embrace this kind of new touchy-feely agenda. And he suggested that his party, quote, just don't make people better off, but that we make people happier. He talked about supplementing GDP with GWP, general well-being. And so it's kind of caught on. Even the hard-nosed Gordon Brown embraced this very Blairite big idea. So, for example, when he created the Department of Innovation, Universities and Skills, he appointed a team to explore, quote, mental capital and well-being. And there is, I think, I'm sure you're all aware, a veritable happiness industry. The Audit Commission added well-being in assessing council's performance. Jeff Mulgan's Young Foundation and the New Economics Foundation were just two of the leading think tanks that worked with and were contracted by councils to pilot emotional resilience schemes in localities across the country. Fast forward to today, and it's very much part of the landscape of local government and the voluntary sector. The chair of the Local Government Association's Community Wellbeing Board, the fact that that even exists is an indication of how embedded it is, David Rogers said, more than ever before, it is vital to look at how what we do as councils affects the health and happiness of the people we represent. And there's been a lot of buy-in, I think. There's few in local politics or the third sector or councils who are really, I think, deeply critical of the happiness agenda as it's presently presented to us. It's, I think, been left to those of us in the media and commentators to be the ones who've taken it on. But I'm aware of the fact, as I stand here, that arguing against the happiness agenda is likely to have you think that I'm some kind of misanthropic miserabilist. I have done this, debated this issue on many times and have been accused of having Victor Meldrew syndrome and wanting everybody in the country to be unhappy. So I'm aware of the fact that you already might have kind of written me off in that way. And at the risk of sounding like a tabloid hack and making cheap jibes, I do want to first of all at least start off with some of the more ludicrous things about it, but I do actually genuinely think there's something seriously problematic for society if we accept this. Okay, so to start with the most superficial then, is happiness measurable? The obvious answer is no. As opinion polling on how happy you are is inevitably subjective, it's inevitably unreliable. The basis of the World Database of Happiness, but this is the kind of typical question, it says, ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most satisfied, all things considered, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with life as a whole now? And surely the only sensible answer is, it depends what you mean by satisfied. It depends what you mean by now, as opposed to last week, perhaps. And as one researcher has pointed out, a survey conducted in the middle of a cold, wet January might produce significantly gloomier results than one carried out in June. It also seems that it's fairly easy, in fact cheap, to manipulate the results. In an experiment in the United States, subjects were asked to answer a personal satisfaction questionnaire after copying a piece of paper. Those who found a dime on the photocopier reported substantially being more satisfied with life than those who didn't. That might explain why the 3,500 empirical studies conducted over the past decades have produced findings that are muddled and indeed contradictory. There are massive discrepancies in the type of questions that have been used in these questionnaires and the scale of respondents involved, and there's little regard shown for how distinct cultures, populations, languages understand terms and concepts such as happiness, well-being and satisfaction. But despite this, policymakers still blithely quote these studies as evidence, evidence that's irrefutable. It's the evidence shows, and you're not supposed to challenge that. There is, of course, some awareness, even amongst the most ardent bean counters, that happiness is quite difficult to audit. The Prime Minister himself agrees that you cannot capture happiness in a spreadsheet. But, you know, despite this, they carry on. And it's now become fashionable to get around this problem of it being too subjective with the retort, it's the science, stupid. Polly Toynbee asserts, quote, that happiness is a real objective phenomenon, scientifically verifiable. And Professor Layard says that happiness is a scientific study. Brain science is employed to give it credibility. There are endless references to breakthroughs in measuring the electric activity in the brain that correlates with emotional pain and sublime joy in order to back up these studies. But I think there's a serious danger here of over-claiming for, even prostituting, the important insights of neuroscience in the name of backing up policy decisions. But even if I accept that the data gleaned from these questionnaires, or even if we've been strapped up on our brain to a brain machine and it's all been measured, even if they were reliable, which I doubt they are, more pertinent, what can be done with the data? What can we conclude by the results that show that 91% of UK citizens are fairly to highly satisfied versus 96% in Sweden? Or that Colombians and Mexicans are amongst the happiest people in the world and the French are really miserable? Mr. Cameron says that the happiness index has a practical purpose to help governments understand the evidence to improve well-being. But which evidence? It seems highly selective to me. All the happiness, and for example, all the happiness indices show that unemployment makes you miserable. Will this mean that the government suspends cuts leading to all redundancies? Seems unlikely. The Prime Minister also notes that the happiness agenda is, quote, important to our goal of creating a more family-friendly country. But ironically, lots of the research and the evidence shows that getting divorced makes people happier, certainly after an unhappy marriage, and you get progressively happier years after your divorce. I doubt that this evidence is likely to be cited by the Conservatives anytime soon. I was involved in an interesting debate at a conference in Israel a few years ago. It was a debate which was led by Lord Layard, and it was attended by a wide range of New Labour policy thinkers who were in Israel to argue that Israel as a country should adopt the happiness agenda. And I was the kind of token objector. It was interesting because quite a lot of the academics from Israel pointed out that they had noted with interest that the evidence showed that deeply religious people topped the league tables. The British secular liberals in the room were horrified and suggested that that was a false version of happiness, and it was up to policymakers to find a replacement for religion. And I think that there's very much underneath this a kind of false consciousness aspect of the discussion. It kind of hints that happiness audits are not quite as neutrally observational as claimed and are more about manipulating people to achieve the correct outcomes. In a debate, I asked the respondents to, I suggested to the people I was debating that a lot of people I knew would say that what made them happy was smoking, binge drinking and eating McDonald's. They pointed out that this was ridiculous. And of course people couldn't be happy if they were smoking, binge drinking, McDonald's eaters. I pointed out that I was and I am happy. But the point was, they said that wasn't real happiness. That was a shallow conception of happiness. Anthony Selden, the headmaster of Wellington College, who has popularised the teaching of happiness lessons in his school and is now a government advisor to the coalition on how to expand that into the state sector. He was on the Moral Maze recently on this very topic, and I am on the panel of the Moral Maze. And I was putting it to him that I used to be a teacher in further education for many years, and that many of the teenagers I knew would say that what would make them happy would be fame and material goods, a bit of bling. Anthony Selden's response was instructive because he said that what we needed to do was to try and help teenagers to realise that living a meaningful life, a happy life, was more than materialism, and that fame was superficial and that bling was superficial. So in other words, people say, this makes me happy, and they say that shouldn't make you happy, this should make you happy. Now, whether one agrees or not with Anthony Selden about whether bling is superficial or not, it seems clear here that happiness entrepreneurs are really focused on making us aware of what should make us happier, even if we don't know it yet. Lord Layard, in fact, admits that, quote, we have to use psychology as well as economics because to become happier, we have to change inner attitudes as much as outward circumstances. So he puts himself into the position of changing our inner lives. We began to see then that what's really on offer here is expert or state-sanctioned version of happiness. It's prescriptive and I'd argue dangerously authoritarian. It feeds very neatly into the government's nudge agenda, which aims to use behavioural psychology to change our behaviour without us even knowing it. And it's no surprise that there's a common factor in the person of David Halpern, who was the head of Tony Blair's strategy unit inside No. 10 when they launched their paper Life Satisfaction in 2003, which launched the whole happiness agenda in government, and that David Halpern is now back in No. 10 in David Cameron's nudge unit, ominously named the Behavioural Insight Team, located in Downing Street, and nobody even notices that this sounds like some sinister 1984 plot. Anthony Selden's complaint that society is rather too hung up on material ends and not on the higher plane, I think brings us on to another topic because it reflects the relationship between the happiness agenda and the debate about the economy. Let's remember that happiness economics, that's been so fashionable for the last 20 years, focuses largely on steering on the alleged benefits of prosperity and on skewering the alleged benefits of prosperity. We're constantly cited evidence that despite the fact that GDP has doubled over 30 years in developed countries, people aren't happier. All sorts of quotes on this. Despite being richer with better homes, more cars, mobile phones and foreign holidays, things we strived for in the belief they'd make us happier, people aren't any more happy than they were 60 years ago. And that's generally what we're told all the time. Hence David Cameron's insight that it's time we admitted that there's more to life than money, and a call for a shift of the focus from GDP to GWB, general well-being. Now, one problem with this thesis is I think it's based on an almost willful confusion between correlation and causation. Even if it's true that post-war economic prosperity coincides with people reporting that they're not happier, a lot else has happened in the same period. Everything from the increase in the types of bread that are sold in supermarkets, to an increase in the salaries of footballers, to an increase in the power of computers. I know that might all sound a bit glib, but I don't necessarily think that the prevalence of unhappiness in society can be explained by different types of bread or different numbers of supermarkets or any of those kind of things. But I make the point simply to just point out that to assume the problems in society in relation to alleged unhappiness can be explained in relation to an economic growth actually shows a political prejudice rather than necessarily evidence. It assumes far too much, I think, and also steers dangerously close to demonising economic prosperity and a material aspiration to better ourselves. I think there's a real danger that it even makes a virtue of poverty. According to the New Economic Foundation's Happy Planet Index, if you're ever bored, a way to spend a day, the small island of Vanuatu tops the poll in the Happy Planet Index, and the United States only comes 150th. In GDP terms, Vanuatu comes 207th out of 233. The reason is that Vanuatu's economy is based on subsistence farming, hardly something to celebrate, but according to the New Economics Foundation, it's okay because the poor peasants of Vanuatu are happier than us rich, greedy Westerners. Or look at the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan that has replaced GDP with GNP, Gross National Happiness Index. It's regularly cited by happiness advocates as a model for the West. But 65% of Bhutan lacks electricity, 53% of the population are illiterate, and there's no democracy. Dare I suggest that a bit of Western-style material wealth could do them some good, even if they're a bit more miserable. When GDP is castigated for ignoring emotional well-being, you can end up deprioritising the importance of material improvements in people's lives. When Polly Toynbee was a cheerleader for the happiness agenda under New Labour, she's not so keen now that it's being led by the coalition, but that's just sectarianism. She wrote endless columns telling us that the happiness audit would produce a revolution in the priorities in the NHS and the welfare state. Too right. In Wigan, the well-being, which was a well-being pilot area, there was an experiment to see if life coaches for teenagers would lead to better well-being outcomes than providing state-of-the-art youth facilities. Cheaper, certainly. I hardly need mention the contemporary backdrop of the cuts and the recession that makes this all the more nerve-wracking. Of course, we all know, if asked in a survey to choose between our loved ones and our mental health, or between our loved ones, our mental health versus filthy lucre, which would make us happier, even bankers might reject the millions. However, to be offered that choice by officialdom treads perilously close to forcing us to concede that accepting less pension, lower wages, fewer services is palatable as long as non-materialist happiness boxes are ticked. And while you can't buy happiness has a truth to it, although somewhat banal, we might consider if it's rather too convenient at a time when GDP is static and UK PLC is suffering a decline in wealth, that politicians are so keen to stress our emotional welfare is more important than welfare services or material prosperity.